If you have your Bibles with you this morning, let's turn to the book of Exodus and the 20th chapter, and we're going to look at verse number 3 this morning. Exodus chapter number 20 and verse number 3. We began this series last week of law to live by, and we want to continue on in that this morning, and we want to look at the first law to live by. And if you are keeping track, sports fans in your playbooks, you know that because I preached for 50 minutes last week, that I have only 10 minutes for this week, right? But I promise it's going to be a little bit longer than that, but it won't be quite as bad as last week, and we're going to dive directly into this first law to live by. Before we do, though, this morning, what I want to do is I want to remember ever so briefly how we got here. Remember that God is speaking to a group of people that he has just brought out of the land of Egypt, and they have been brought out to fulfill the word, the promise that God had spoken to Abraham some 600 years before all of this had taken place. They had been in Egypt for 430 years in bondage to slavery and under the Egyptian rule. And so God was bringing them out to deliver to them or to give to them the promise that he had spoken to their forefather Abraham. And he was going to give them a land. He was going to take them to what we call the promised land. He was going to give them a land. And that land was supposed to reflect the nature and character of God himself. It was supposed to be a place, or to become a place, that he would inhabit with his people, that his name would live there, and his glory would reign in their presence. Now, the problem with that is that the people just had too much Egypt in them. For 430 years, they had lived under this bondage. They had lived under this worldview. They had seen the pagan gods worshipped and so on and so forth. And so there was just too much Egypt left in the people. And so in order to set up a land like that, in order to give these people that type of land, where his glory would dwell forever, God was going to have to do something to the people. And that was that they were going to have to be a different people. The people were going to have to be committed to being special, to being a nation that would reflect that nature, that glory of God, that honor of God. They were going to have to be a people who began to reflect the law that God wanted to instill. And so in order to do that, God first of all brings them to Mount Sinai to have a conversation to define what different looks like. I mean, it's one thing to be peculiar, but you've got to be peculiar for the right reasons, right? I mean, there are all kinds of different people in the world, but it's got to be different for the right reasons. So he brings them here to Mount Sinai to have a conversation, and in that conversation, he basically establishes himself as the basis or the authority upon which different is supposed to look. In other words, he brings them there and he establishes upon himself the foundation of the law that they are going to live by. He answered the question, as it were, as we talked about last week, the who says. You remember that, parents, right? Is when your children you're giving them a command and they don't want to do it. Eventually, there's normally a point at some point in their life where they say, well, who says that's the way it is? Who says that I got to go to bed? Who says that I have to eat those nasty green beans, right? And you have to establish the authority upon which you're speaking. Well, God does that for these people here at Mount Sinai. It wasn't enough for them to transfer their slavery from Pharaoh to God. God wanted to establish a completely different working relationship. He wanted their obedience. He wanted their slavery, as the Apostle Paul would talk about in the book of Romans. He wanted their slavery to righteousness, but it needed to be for the right reasons. And he establishes those commandments, those 10 laws to live by, but he must base them upon something great, and that was he was going to base them upon himself. In verse number 2, he said to Moses, I am the Lord your God, the one who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. In other words, the establishment of the law to live by would rest upon God himself and who he was. He reminded them that he was the one who had delivered them out of the house of slavery. He was the one who had brought them out of Egypt. He was the maker of heaven and earth, the great God who'd created all things. And also he reminded them that he was their covenant God, that they were in a special relationship with him. And upon that foundation was the basis for their obedience. And I said last week, it's the same for us. Our obedience this morning on God, our obedience this morning on God's law is based upon who God is. Because God has delivered us, because of who God is, that he's the great maker of heaven and earth, because of that covenant relationship, and because of all that God has done, you and I, as God's people, are to be obedient to him. Now this morning, what I want to do is I want to turn to that first law, that law there in verse number 3 that says we're not going to have any other gods before him. But before you get there too fast, let me give you a couple of things that I think are important. There are two logical concepts that are going to drive the rest of our conversation over the next 10 weeks or so, and they are so fundamental to even this very first command. And they are, first of all, there is a distinct logical ordering to God's revelation here in Exodus chapter 20. In other words, God was being very orderly as he is giving them the law. He wasn't haphazardly throwing it together, but purposely as he builds this law in Exodus chapter 20, these 10 commandments, he is going to build one right on top of the other, upon the next, as each lays a foundation for the next. In other words, God was setting a system of beliefs that would shape our living and change the way you and I operate in the world. But he didn't do so haphazardly, but rather he put it together in a marvelous order and a fashion so that it would shape everything about us. Here's what I mean. The first 4 commands, and you already know this, are in direct reference to man's relationship with God. That is, that the first 4 things have everything to do with the individual and his relationship with God and how he can relate to him. On the other hand, the last 6 are all about our relationship to the people around us, or to our neighbor, or to the rest of mankind. Well, that's going to get illustrated quite pointedly in the New Testament, and one of my favorite places is in Mark chapter 12. I want you to turn there ever so briefly with me. Mark chapter 12, the story is unfolding that Jesus is being watched by religious leaders and elites and philosophers, as it were. They're watching his ministry. They're looking at what he's doing. They're listening to what he's saying. In fact, many of them are asking questions for the purpose of tripping him up. They want to see if they can get him in a bad answer, right? And Mark chapter 12 tells us a story about one of the students, one of the scribes that was there. And I want to begin in verse 28. And it says these words, "And as one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he answered them well." In other words, because he heard the answers that Jesus was giving, and he found them liberating, because he found them life-giving, because he found them satisfactory, because he had heard them answer them well, he asked him a question. That question was, which commandment is the most important of all? Jesus answered, the most important is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your mind and with all of your strength." The second is like it, and it is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Remember, the religious leaders are trying to trip him up, but this is one of my favorite tellings of this story, because in it, Mark shows us that there was a man in the midst of all of those religious leaders who had a really sincere question. How do I know that the man was being sincere? How do I know that he wasn't like the others? How do I know that he wasn't like the Sadducees when he asked this question? He wasn't trying to trip Jesus up. Well, Mark gives us 2 indications. First of all, that it says that when he heard Jesus was answering them well. In other words, what Jesus was saying spoke to the man, and he thought to himself, this guy's got some answers to life's questions. The second part of it is that after Jesus responds, you will notice that the man responds back to Jesus, and he says, yes, but loving your neighbor is more than alms. It's more than sacrifice. In other words, you've got to really be committed to your neighbor. You can't just say that you are on a Sunday morning. Jesus' response was telling. He responded back to him, and he says, you are not far from the kingdom. In other words, you have almost got it, little buddy. You are almost right there. You are so close. You are so close you can almost smell it. That little fellow there, the scribe, he wanted to know how to honor God in his life. In simple terms, he was asking for the worldview that we were talking about. He wanted to know how to govern his life. And he thought to himself one day, if I could just know what is the most important command in all of Scripture, and if I would get really proficient at doing that one thing, God would really be happy, and it would change everything about me. And so he asked Jesus that question. What is the greatest commandment? Well, Jesus gave him a response, and it's consistent with his response in other places, and it's consistent with what we have here in Exodus chapter 20, and that was that Jesus summarized the Old Testament law into two parts. He said, number one, you've got to love God, and number two, you have to love your neighbor. You want to know what right religion is this morning? You want to know what real religion is this morning? You want to know what right faith is this morning? It is loving God with all that you are and loving your neighbor as yourself. That's what Jesus was responding with. That response is important because it is the sum of the 10 commandments when you look at them. The law to live by was based on these two premises. The first 4, here's how you love God. The second 6, that is, this is how you love your neighbor. In the first 4, God was commanding his people to give him their affection, to give him their love. And he was telling them, this is how I know that you love me. This is how you will show your love to me. You won't have any other gods before me. You'll follow these 4 commands, right? On the other hand, he was saying to them that this is how you can love your neighbor. This is how you can love your friends if you'll follow these 6 commands. Don't lie and steal and cheat and don't deceive anyone. Don't covet your neighbor's properties and possessions. So if that's right, if Mark chapter 12 is to be taken in context of Exodus chapter 20, then what we're really asking over the next 10 weeks is 2 questions. Number 1, how do I love God? And number 2, how do I love my neighbor? If this is God's law to live by, then it's really just answering those 2 questions. How do I love God? And how do I love my neighbor? There's a second logical concept that I think drives this passage that's important, and I want you to hang with me. I know it's a little bit technical, but it's important because I want you to notice that the first 4 laws relate to man to God. The last 6 relate man to each other. But then in my mind, I have another question, and that is, why did he do it that way? I don't know about you, but every once in a while, Kelly and I have had the opportunity to go and look at art. And I look at what an artist does, and I admit to you that I have nothing artsy about me at all, right? There is not a creative gene anywhere in my bones. You give me a project, I can put it together and get it done. But in my mind, I look at some of it and I say, that's stupid, you know? I mean, why would he do it that way? Why wouldn't he put this over here? Or here's an even better one, and men will relate to this. Isaiah got a car a couple years ago for Christmas, and I went to put it together, and I did what you're never supposed to do. And you know what that was? I read the directions. And there's an unwritten law among men that we live by. Don't read the directions. I read the directions. I began to look at the car, and I thought to myself, they shouldn't put it together like this. I know better. After a couple hours, I gave it to Kelly, and she got it together for him, right? Because I have to know, how do you do this? Why do you do it? Why would you put it this way? As I look at these commands and I see their order and their logic, I see them they're in their progression, I think to myself, why would God do it this way? Why would he put it in this order? To put it in contrast, a couple of weeks ago, I walked into the office on a Monday morning, and I sat down with Christy and I said, here's the deal. Over the next 4 weeks, this is everything that I need done. For the next hour and a half, I laid out a map of everything that needed to be done. If you could look at her notes, this is what you would find. For conversation number 1, this week we need to do a mail out on whatever it was. Next week, in 3 weeks, what I need you to do is this. Next week, I need you to do this. 4 weeks from now, I need you to do this. Oh, and by the way, this week, before I forget about it, you need to do this as well. You see the chaos there? My mind, I just don't work that way. I just kind of jump around. You can understand why she has such a difficult job, right? I mean, she's got to sort through this when we're all said and done. There's no logical or cohesion. But God's not like me. God's altogether different than I am. He puts everything together with reason and logic, and everything that he does has a purpose and a meaning behind it. And in that vein, why would he command these things to be listed first and these things to be listed last? Why is it that command number 1 is to not have any other gods before him, and then command number 10 is to not covet your neighbor's possessions? Does it mean that God was giving one of them primary focus over another? Does it mean that one was more important than another? In other words, did God say in this moment, listen, you should have no other gods before me, and when you get done with that, if you have time, work on the others, right? If you have time, try not to covet what your neighbor has. Is that why he put it in that order? And the answer for me, I think, is no. You see, what God, I think, was doing was he was laying out a structure or the natural order to living life itself. And I think you'll understand this as you see it play out. The first commands are the prima facie in that they are built so that the next command can be built upon them. God understood that if man did not relate properly to him, he could not relate properly to anything else or anybody else for that matter. And so he lays out the first 4 commands to develop man's relationship with him, knowing that if man could master that, if he could master that relationship, then the other 6 things would begin to fall into place. Let me put it to you in another way this morning. Your relationship with God has direct ramification and application to your relationship with the person sitting next to you. In other words, the way you treat the person next to you is a direct mirror or image or a glimpse into what your real relationship with God looks like. The reason he put the first 4 there was because he knew that if man was in right relationship with him, the rest of it would begin to fall in place. And when man on the negative side is not in a right relationship with him, then he cannot be in a right relationship with his neighbor. Let me give you one example of this. Jacob is a perfect example. He lives his entire life, or the better part of the first half of his life at least, in constant strife with everybody. He's in strife with his father-in-law, and who among us hasn't done that? He's in strife with his brother, right? He's in strife with all the people around him. But the person that he is most in strife with is God himself. He settles that matter with God. He wrestles with God, and he comes to terms with God. Really, I should say he comes to God's terms, and he surrenders to him. And you know what the next thing that happens is? Esau comes to him, and Jacob thinks this is the end. And instead, Esau is seeking out reconciliation. He's seeking out a new relationship. In other words, the writer is telling us that when Jacob began to have a right relationship with God, it began to impact his relationship with Esau and all the other people around him. I think God understood as he lays out these 10 commandments, if you'll get the first 4, listen, the other things are going to come with them. They're going to follow suit. You're going to have a right relationship with the people around you, but first you got to have a right relationship with God himself. So without any further ado, law number 1, Exodus 20, verse number 3, you shall have no other gods before me. Such a simple command when you think about it. And you say, well, there can't surely be 30 minutes in there. Let's see if we can get our best shot at it, right? Such a simple command. What I want to do this morning is I want to break it down into a couple of units, and then let's bring it back to a conclusion. First of all, who is the you that he's speaking of? That little first word, you shall have no other gods before me. It's not a hard question to answer. In fact, it may even seem really silly to ask, and yet at the same time, it's fundamental. You know that the you referred here to the people of Israel, this new nation that was being formed and brought into the promised land, right? They were the people whom God had made promises to. They were the people whom God had redeemed. They were the people whom God had declared that he would inhabit, that he would instruct them in righteousness. They were, in short, a special people, a chosen people of all the people of the earth. God had chosen Abraham and his offspring, these people, to be the heirs of his promises and to be the heirs of his blessings. In short there, God was saying, you as my people, God's people, as the covenantal people. It was not to all the people on the earth he was giving this command, but rather he was giving it to his covenantal people. Now you say, are you saying, preacher, that means that the one true God should take second place to any of the gods of the pagans? And the answer to that is obviously no. I believe he's the one true God, and I believe he's revealed himself as such, most supremely in the incarnation of his son, sending his son to earth to die on our behalf. My point is to say that among God's redeemed people, God was speaking exclusively to them. You are not to have any other gods before me. As my people, as the redeemed people, as the bought people, as the chosen people, as the special people, you aren't supposed to have any other gods before me. Why is that important? Well, it's important because it's in the nature of man to always worry about what someone else is doing. I mean, if I do something wrong, my natural reaction is to blame Kelly. It's only natural, right? I mean, it's in all of us. We have this natural desire never to actually deal with our own problems, but to look at somebody else. Peter did this with John, right? When Jesus told Peter that he was going to be martyred for his faith in Christ, he said, what about John? What about that apostle? What are you going to do with him? In church life, we see it over and over again. People serve, and I don't know how many times I've been at that church work day and somebody says, I don't understand why other people aren't here. I don't either, but I can't do anything about it, right? Or at a Bible study, somebody says, I just don't understand why more folks don't come, why this isn't more important. Listen, I don't either, but our natural desire is to look at other people, and God was saying in this moment, you can't do that. You, as my redeemed people, you shall have no other gods before me. I can't deal, I personally cannot deal with the religions of another person. I cannot make them accept this. But here's the deal. I can handle my own business, right? I have no other gods before him. That's my responsibility as his redeemed child. What God was saying in this moment was, don't worry about everybody else, but rather you look inwardly, and you, as my people, the chosen people, the redeemed people, you shall have no other gods before me. He goes on and he says, shall have. That little word have, it implies possession. It's a possessive term. In other words, if I say to you this morning, I have a baseball, it means one of two things. Either A, that the baseball is in my presence as we speak, it's in my hand, or B, I own a baseball and it is at my house amongst my possessions, or it is somewhere amongst my possessions. Therefore, the command is a possessive command. You shall not have, you shall not possess either in your immediate presence or amongst your possessions of your home. You shall not have other gods. Why is that important? Well, it's a powerful piece of the puzzle because of what I wrote this week on the discussion board on the blog. Turn with me ever so quickly to Deuteronomy chapter 4. I think this is such a great passage. Moses is speaking to the people, and he's talking to them about the greatness of God and God's law and what God has done for them. And he's speaking to them about how they should respond to that with obedience. They should do as God has commanded. Pick it up in verse number 7, Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse number 7 and verse number 8. Moses says, for what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us whenever we call upon him? In other words, what other people of the earth have a God that is so near that when they call upon him, he is available? He's ready. He's there to answer their prayers. He's there to listen to their voice. Then he asks a second question, and that is, he says, and what great nation is there that has statutes and rules so righteous, so as all this law that I set before you today? In other words, Moses said to the people, not only do we have a God who is near, but we have laws that are perfect, that are righteous. God's commands for us are absolutely everything that we need. It was two rhetorical questions. The first was, who has a God so near? Think about it from 21st century of the world today, postmodern society. In Islam, Allah is not a near God. He can be reached through radical acts, but he's nowhere close to mankind. In non-dualistic Hinduism, the gods are not near, nor are they even present, but they are watching over. They're looking at the happenings. They're waiting for man to approach him. In pantheism, God is everything, therefore he's nothing. God is the rock, he's also the sky, he's the sun, he's the number 2 pencil in the offering plate, right? He's everything, and therefore there's nothing distinct about him, and he becomes nothing. In Buddhism, enlightenment is the divine, called nirvana. So there is no absolute supernatural. We just call enlightenment God. And then you have atheism that says there's no supernatural at all. So there's no help whatsoever in this life for me. Only in the Christian faith is God present with us. Only among every other major religion of the world, only the Christian religion offers to us a God who is with us. In fact, in the New Testament, he would come by the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. Second, Moses asks another rhetorical question, which is, what law can compete with God's law? And the obvious answer is nothing. The obvious implication is that nothing and nobody can compete with God, nor can anybody compete with his statutes for us to live by. Now, I want you to think with me for a few moments. There's a reason why those two verses, why they're tied together. And the reason why is because God cannot be near if we are constantly putting him in the presence of that which he finds abominable. Here's what I mean. When I got married, I found out something about my wife, Miss Kelly, that I didn't know really ahead of time. I guess I should have known it, but I never really paid a lot of attention to what she ordered. She loves onions. And I talked about this on the blog. Everything about onions is Kelly, okay? She would put onions in chocolate cake if we could get away with it, right? That is just her. She loves them. I hate all things onion. I mean, there is not a person who could stand onions less than I do. In fact, I'm pretty certain that Hitler made onions a national food in Nazi Germany. That's how much I hate onions. I can smell them out. I have told waitresses when they went to take my order, I'm allergic to onions. So if this comes with onions, I'm coming after you, right? I hate all things onions. We get married, first year, right? Kelly decides, I'm gonna slip some onions in food, right? She thinks to herself, he'll probably not notice, you know? I mean, they just add a little flavor. Listen, this dog can hunt, okay? I can smell onions from a mile away. Right? So then she goes and spends hard-earned money to get one of those little dicer things, right? Get them really, really small. Then we'll stick them in there. He'll never know. Listen, I could tell every time we reached a crossroads. What are we going to do about this? Listen, folks, I hit the lottery when I got married, and I know that. I don't know what Kelly hit, maybe a deer on the side of the road or something, but I hit the lottery. For the last 9 years, you know what Miss Kelly does for me? She never puts onions in food until after my portion has been taken out, and then she'll put hers in there. You know why she does that? Only one reason: she loves me. I have no idea why she loves me. I have no real logical reasoning for it, but she loves me, and so she doesn't subject me to them. The reason Moses could say in this moment, we have a God so near and we have a law that is righteous, that is perfect, is because God was not going to be subjected to that which he found abominable. I am amazed that we live in a culture of Christianity where believers think to themselves, I can profess my faith on Sunday morning. I can profess my faith at this gathering or that ministry or whatever it is, and then I can subject God to whatever I want to the rest of the week. It doesn't matter what his law says. It doesn't matter what his commands are. It doesn't matter because I am saved by the grace of God and I can live however I want. I am amazed by a culture of Christianity that would adopt that as their motto. God says he has a rule to live by. And if you want him to dwell with you, and I know that we have the indwelling of the Holy Spirit in the New Testament, and he will not leave us nor forsake us, but you understand the gist is that if you want God's presence moving, active in your life, you cannot subject him to that which he finds abominable. Here in Deuteronomy chapter 4, that's what God was laying out before the people here with Moses. He was saying, if you want me, if you want my presence, and in fact, after the golden calf incident, what is it exactly that God says he's going to take away? His presence. He says, I'm not going to go with you. I'll consume you. I'll take you up. I'll burn you up. See, the attribute of God and his presence, his nearness, is something that we oftentimes take for granted. Second question of, who has a law like ours relies on the first, because we serve a God that is near to us, not a God who watches from a distance, but a God who is active and present in our daily living. We serve a God who is present with us, regularly with us. The New Testament fully realizes this in the coming of the Holy Spirit. It's shadowed in the Old Testament in places like this right here, but it is a marvelous truth that we have taken for granted. These folks took it for granted. We still do it today. As God's people, you have been possessed by God and you possess him. He is your God and you are his people. In other words, he would be in their presence, he will be in your presence, he was in their living, and he's in your living. Dr. Tony Evans said it like this: God becomes the umbrella upon which all of life comes underneath. You, God says in this moment, as God's redeemed people, shall have, that is to possess or to be in the presence of, no other gods before me. That little word before can be translated two ways. Nothing new here. You've heard it before. First, it can mean that there is a pecking order. In other words, in that case, we have to understand what a God is in order to understand the pecking order. If he's saying that there can't be any other God above me, is he implying that there are other supernatural powers that you might put ahead of him? Well, the first thing we have to define is a God. What is a God? Well, in simple terms, over the last 150 years, we have defined a God as something or someone worthy of worship. That leads to a second question. What is worship? In our culture, we think worship is music. Music is not worship. Music is an expression of what worship is. What is worship? Worship is praise, adoration, and expressions of devotion. Worship is praise, adoration, and expressions of devotions. So in this case, if it is a pecking order, God was saying to the people and to us that there is nothing in your life that is worthy of your praise, your adoration, nor your devotion above me. There can be nothing in your life worthy of worship ahead of me. In other words, God could not and he would not play second to anything. A second way you could translate it is you could say that it means to be besides. In that case, God would be saying that these people could not be in possession of him and another thing or person worthy of worship simultaneously. In other words, you could not say, I've got God right here, and then I've got this which is worthy of my worship, and I'm going to take the two of them together. God was making an exclusive claim. He was saying to the people that it is me and me alone. He would be saying to the people that they had possession of him or they didn't have possession of him. They could not have possession of him and have something else worthy of worship. We live in a culture where people think, well, I'll take God, but I want to add all these little things to it, right? I want to add all these things that I like. I want to add all these things that are worthy of my praise, of my adoration, and my expressions of devotion. You know what I hear when I hear those three words? Praise, adoration, and expressions of devotions. You know what I think of? Arrowhead Stadium. To be quite blunt with you, that's what I think of. I think of Busch Stadium for Cardinals fans. I think of how wrapped up we get in those things. We see something we find awe-inspiring, and what do? We praise, right? We want to express our adoration. We buy other men's jerseys with their names on them and put them on our back. We want to show our acts or expressions of devotion. We spend too much money to go to the games, and then we go on Facebook and tell everybody about how great it was, right? That's what I think of when I hear praise, adoration, and expressions of devotion. I don't know. I want to be real clear this morning. I'm not legalistic. I love the Cardinals. I love sports. I love hobbies, all of those things. I'm not saying that you can't have hobbies, that you can't love sports teams. What I'm saying is God was specifically pronouncing a judgment against or a law against prohibiting his people from giving two things worship simultaneously. You cannot give me worship and something else that you have deemed worthy of worship. We cannot exist simultaneously. We cannot be in each other's presence. So in other words, he was saying, taken together, God was saying, you as my redeemed people shall have, possess, or be in the presence of no other gods, items, or people worthy of your praise, adoration, and expressions of devotion before, either in pecking order or in presence, me, the covenantal God who delivered you out of Egypt. You can have nothing and nobody else take my place in your living. It was an exclusive claim on the part of God. He was saying to them, nobody and nothing else can ascend to my position in your life. Let me bring it home really fast this morning. We walked into this text by way of Mark chapter 12, and we said that the 10 Commandments ask two questions, don't they? Number one, how do I love God? And number two, how do I love my neighbor? Because the command, this command is the first on the list, and it's in that list of the first four that relate to God, well, then it's trying to answer that first question, isn't it? How do I love God? What does God require of me if I'm going to love him? Well, what he's saying is that he has to have a premier and exclusive place in your life. Nothing else in life is worthy of your praise, of your adoration, of your expressions of devotion. God alone is singularly worthy of those things. This week I got to go to a soccer game, and there's some folks back there that I sat with, and they know this. I know nothing about soccer. I mean, less than nothing. I would like to officiate it sometime, but I know less than nothing about soccer, okay? And we're watching the game unfold. And it had kind of gotten to the end of the game, and things were unraveling a little bit for the other team. And there was a kick from one of the girls across to the middle of the field, and then in a sweep sweeping move. A girl who's right-handed kicked with her left foot, curved the ball around the goalie and into the corner post. And I went, wow! I have told everybody about it. I got home and I said, Kelly, you will not believe what I saw. I went to the NWTF banquet last night where they're talking about turkeys, and I said, let me tell you what I saw Thursday night. It was the most amazing thing I had ever seen on a soccer field in all my life. God is not saying that there are not things that we praise in life. He's saying that there's nothing that puts them above him. There's nothing that is praiseworthy in your life that is greater than he. The problem is that most of us don't live that way. Yesterday, I was having a discussion with Chuck Marshall on the way back to our house, and I guess he didn't think he was going to end up in the sermon, but I decided to put him in there anyway, and he was in the first service, so he knows this. We were discussing the rapid pace of our society and how busy we keep our teens these days. Let me be real with you this morning and take a moment and kind of drive home a point. If your kids play sports in school, the school system has your kids for 2,028 hours a year on the average year. 2,028 hours every average year. 2,028. Think about that number, okay? And before I go any further, I want to be really clear. I am not indicting the education system. There might be places that I would do so. I am thankful that we have great teachers and administrators in this church of not only Sedalia School District, but Knob Noster and Smithton and others around, Green Ridge. I'm thankful for who God has brought in. This is not an indictment on the school system, because it's not just about the teachers and the administrators. It's about the other kids that influence your kids. They come from different backgrounds. Their families teach something different, so on and so forth. 2,028 hours a year the school system has your kids to influence them. Multiply that by 13 years from the time they're kindergarten through 12th grade, and you will find out that the school influences your kids 26,364 hours before they go to college. 26,364 hours before they step into a college classroom. Now, if you only subject your kids to what Christianity today called average attendance, if you subjected your kids to 1 hour a week of church, now let's go a little bit further and say that you were really faithful, and so you sent them to youth group as well. So they would get 2 hours of church a week, right? Let's suppose you did that for 48 weeks out of the year. That would be about a 95% attendance rating. Very few folks get quite that good, but 95%, 48 weeks out of the year. That would mean that every year the church would influence your kids 96 hours to 2,028 by the school. That would mean over the same span of time, over 13 years, when the school influenced your kids 26,364 hours, you allowed your kids to be influenced by the church and religion 1,248 hours. Let me ask you a question. Is it any wonder why this morning the kids get the impression that there are some things in life that are more important than others? Is there any reason, is it any wonder why our kids get the impression that some things are more important than others? I'll use my own son as an example. Isaiah's going to play T-ball this year, or whatever, I think it's T-ball this year. And we got the schedule the other day of when they're going to do practices. They're going to do practices for T-ball, for Pete's sake. I mean, this is not that hard. We got the schedule for the practices. Sat down late last night, working on the message, and began to do some preparation. Added up the practice time, the game times, so on and so forth. And if we just subjected him to Sunday school and church on a weekly basis, you know what? T-ball would influence him more in 2 months than the church did in 3 years. Is it any wonder why our students and kids believe that there are some things in life more important than others? God will not play second fiddle to nothing and nobody in your life. If you love God, and a lot of people say they do love God, he takes center stage. You, as the redeemed people of God, shall have, possess, or have in your belongings nothing else worthy of your praise, adoration, and expressions of devotion before me, your covenantal God. How do I know if God has taken center stage in my life? I know this may be not always popular, but I just want you to consider this morning. You say, I love God. How do I know that he's taken center stage in my life? Same way you love your spouse. Let me put it in terms like this. Miss Kelly wants time from me. She wants me to sit around and just be in her presence sometimes. Not say anything, but be in her presence, right? She wants me to enjoy her company and the same. She wants truthfulness and faithfulness from me. She doesn't want me to be unfaithful. In fact, if I told her that I loved her, but I continually was unfaithful, she'd begin to believe that I'm not telling the truth, right? If I continually tell her lies and tell her that I love her at the same time, she's going to wonder which is the truth. She wants commitment from me. She wants to know that I'll be there when she needs me. She wants to know that when the right time approaches, that I can be there in a moment's notice, that I'll always take her phone calls. She wants communication from me. She wants to sit down and talk about her day, and she wants me to talk about my day, and she wants to actually talk about things. She wants to actually work through things. You know what else she wants from me? She wants financial resources. Let me tell you, what do you think would happen if I went home from church today and I looked at my wife and I said, you know, I love you. There's nobody in the world I love more than I love you. But just so we're clear, you have no access to the bank accounts. I'll tell you exactly what would happen. You'd have a pulpit committee next week because I'd be a dead man. And yet this is exactly how people approach the church. No time. Let me rephrase. This is exactly how people approach God. No time, no commitment, no faithfulness, aren't always truthful, don't communicate, and quite frankly, they say, you can have everything else, but my finances are off limits. So I'll conclude this morning with a simple question. Do you love God? Do you love him? If you do, his law to live by says nothing and nobody else will take center stage in your life. Stand with me reverently and let's pray. Father, thank you so much for this morning and for the opportunity